Do the bye weeks have you scrambling for players? Are you fighting for your fantasy playoff lives? It's time to take a look at the Week 13 sleepers, streamers, and boom plays. I'm Anthony Aniano from RotoBaller.com and RotoBaller Radio with you, taking a look at some players who can help push you over the top in your Week 13 fantasy football matchups. Folks, don't forget Week 13 features 6 teams on a bye. The New York Giants, Baltimore Ravens, Buffalo Bills, Minnesota Vikings, Chicago Bears, and the Las Vegas Raiders. So, players who may be flying under the radar, maybe not talked about much, maybe really have been steady but haven't given you that monster game. Time to look at a few of those that maybe you want to get in your lineup. And we'll start at the quarterback position. My boom play, my sleeper play for Week 13 at quarterback. Take a look at Kenny Pickett of the Pittsburgh Steelers. A different offense in Week 12 now with the new offensive coordinator and Matt Canada out of Pittsburgh. Kenny Pickett against the Arizona Cardinals. He averages 10.1 fantasy points per game, but keep in mind last week he threw the ball 33 times with 24 completions and a season-high 278 passing yards. This against the defense that allowed Matthew Stafford 4 touchdown passes last week. Stafford was my boom play quarterback last week because of that matchup against Arizona. I'm doubling down on that this week. I'll continue to pick on that Cardinal defense with Kenny Pickett and the Pittsburgh Steelers. The key for Pickett, he's got to get the ball in the end zone. He has to throw for some touchdowns this week, and we'll talk about a few of his options there as well in a little bit. Arizona allows 237.8 passing yards per game. They allow 22.5 fantasy points per game to opposing QBs with 21 passing touchdowns allowed. The third most passing touchdowns allowed of any team playing this week. The only teams that have allowed more passing touchdowns this week are the Washington Commanders and the Philadelphia Eagles. At the running back positions, 2 running backs to be mindful of this week. Rachaad White of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Not really a sleeper. People are using him. But the reason I mention him is I expect more than what he has been giving you in PPR formats. He's averaging 15.2 fantasy points per game. Solid each and every week. And he's got 6 straight games of over 15 fantasy points. But of those 6 games, only one of those is over 20. I expect Rachaad White to have another monster type of game, over 20 fantasy points this week against the Carolina Panthers. The Panthers allow just under 125 rushing yards per game. They've allowed 27.7 points per game in a PPR format to opposing running backs. And they have allowed a total, an astronomical number, 18 total touchdowns to the running back position, 15 on the ground and 3 through the air. They've allowed more touchdowns to opposing running backs than any other team this week. They're tied with the Arizona Cardinals for those most touchdowns allowed to running backs. The reason I like Rachaad White over a Jaylen Warren or a Najee Harris is just that reason. With Pittsburgh, you never know right now which running back is going to be the running back to go off. With Tampa, we know it'll be Rachaad White. He is in a smash matchup this week against the Carolina Panthers. My second running back is Devin Singletary of the Houston Texans going up against the Denver Broncos. Singletary's averaging 9.1 points per game on the season. Last week, he excelled in the passing game with 6 receptions for 54 receiving yards. Now, Denver, we know, allows a ton of yards on the ground. Over 155 rushing yards per game and 30.4 points per game in a PPR format to the running back position. The most points per game allowed to the running back in the league. Denver, although playing better, still susceptible to the run. Now, they've allowed 13 total touchdowns to running backs this season, 9 rushing and 4 receiving. Now, here's where I like Singletary. As a season average, Denver is allowing 5.8, let's round it to 6, receptions a game. They allow, on average, about 41 receiving yards a game to the running back. So forget about anything rushing. Just receiving the ball, Singletary's on pace to give you 10 points based on what Denver allows on a week-by-week average. You adding some rushing numbers, you adding the fact that they've allowed 13 touchdowns to running backs, and Devin Singletary could be in line for a really big matchup this week against the Denver Broncos. Moving over to the wide receiver position, if we like Kenny Pickett, we like George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers as well. Pickens against Arizona. Now, he's averaging 12.2 points per game on the season is Pickens. Last week, 3 catches, 58 yards on 5 targets. Now, he hasn't had 10 or more fantasy points since week 7, so be mindful of that. But against Arizona, I'm going to exploit that Arizona Cardinal defense. Arizona has allowed 35.4 points per game in a PPR format to opposing wide receivers. Like I said earlier, they've allowed 21 passing touchdowns. Of those 21, 10 to opposing wide receivers. Other wide receivers I like this week, Curtis Samuel of the Washington Commanders against the Miami Dolphins. Commanders' defense is terrible. Miami's going to put up points. Sam Howell's going to have to throw the ball to keep up, and Curtis Samuel has become a safety valve for Sam Howell, as evidenced by those 12 targets, 9 receptions, and 100 yards last week. Miami has allowed the 10th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers at 36.5 in a PPR format, and have allowed 16 passing touchdowns, 12 of which to opposing wide receivers. Miami's allowed 10 or more fantasy points to 12 wide receivers already this season. Nice matchup for Curtis Samuel, especially in a PPR format. My final wide receiver, I'm giving you 3 this week. Some will think is a little bit of a stretch, but here's the sleeper, Jonathan Mingo against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers of the Carolina Panthers. Getting more and more involved in that Carolina offense. Last week was targeted 6 times, 4 receptions, 460 yards. It was his season high 10 fantasy points for Mingo. Over the last 3 games, Jonathan Mingo has been targeted 19 times. Now, he still plays second fiddle to Adam Thielen. I get that. But if Carolina trying to see what Mingo has, as you see Bryce Young looking for him more and more, averaging 6 targets per game. Tampa Bay allows the 4th most points to opposing wide receivers at 39.8 PPR points per game. And they've allowed 16 passing touchdowns to have the Buccaneers, 11 of which have gone to opposing wide receivers. And finally, at the tight end position, I go back to picking on the Arizona Cardinals. Pat Freiermuth was one of my top waiver ads of the week, and he stays in your lineup this week against the Arizona Cardinals. Remember, Arizona allowed 2 touchdowns to Tyler Higbee last week. Freiermuth comes off his best game, 9 catches, 120 yards, and they've allowed 5 touchdowns this season to the tight end position. Like I said, 2 of them last week to Tyler Higbee. My second boom play, I don't know if I could call him a sleeper, but he's certainly a boom play this week. Kyle Pitts should, on paper, have a terrific game against the New York Jets. Now, we've been saying that about Kyle Pitts for a few years now, no doubt about it. But Kyle Pitts, who's only got 2 games of 10 or more fantasy points all season long, and only averaging 7.9 points per game on the season, does go against a Jets defense that allows just under 12 points per game to opposing tight ends, and they have allowed 6 tight ends to the tight end position alone. More touchdowns to tight ends than to the wide receiver is what the Jets have allowed. They've only allowed 3 touchdowns all season to the wide receiver position, double that amount to opposing tight ends. The New York Jets have allowed 7 tight ends 10 or more fantasy points already this year. So to recap, my Week 13 sleepers, streamers, and boom plays at the quarterback position, Kenny Pickett. Running backs, Rachaad White and Devin Singletary. Wide receivers, George Pickens, Curtis Samuel, and Jonathan Mingo. And at the tight end position, Pat Freiermuth and Kyle Pitts. As always, ladies and gentlemen, head over to RotoBaller.com. Sign up now. Use the promo code ACES and save at checkout for any of our premium passes. Like and subscribe right here to the RotoBaller YouTube channel. Download the RotoBaller app. It's free. 6 sports right in the palm of your hand, whether you play DFS or season-long formats. Give me a follow on Twitter at @Aniano Fantasy, and we will see you next time right here on RotoBaller Radio.